Good morning, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you for everyone that's in attendance. So today we'll be covering Team United Kingdom's cybersecurity risk assessment. We're also going to be diving into some of the events discovered during the economic summit as we hope to get a better understanding of the origins of some of the identified vulnerabilities. I would also like to take this time to introduce Team UK members who each bring a level of expertise in various areas. First is John Tua, Eric Turkson, myself, Matt Wiesner, and Robert Wolf. Why are we here? Well, I'll tell you why we're here. So, Team United Kingdom is an active participant in the Five Eyes Alliance. So, it's essential that we share critical information that pertains to global cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities. Particularly to the UK, we have our fair share of concerns, which we'll certainly address in the upcoming slides. However, more importantly, during this presentation, it's important that we all discover and acknowledge that we have common enemies. And summits like these only promote resiliency and robust cybersecurity efforts. So with that being said, let's take a look at today's agenda. We'll start with our vulnerability assessment overview and its importance. We'll then go into current measures, specifically authentication, authorization, and access control. Then we'll dive into threats and vulnerabilities and how people, technology, and policy impact them. Then we'll unveil our United Kingdom vulnerability matrix. Then we'll go into our analysis of our attack vectors and attribution, followed by risk tolerance, and lastly, give recommendations that not only help us, but should impact all members of the Five Eye Alliance. A vulnerability assessment is an ongoing, effective process that provides assessment coverage for the entire network infrastructure to ensure proper notification, approval, and coordination, then takes a decisive action to track critical vulnerabilities until they are corrected. So what does that all mean? To quickly sum it up, we can understand a vulnerability assessment to be a systematic review of security weaknesses as they pertain to people, processes, and technology. Ultimately, we're evaluating vulnerability susceptibility. As promised, authentication. So, by definition, authentication is the process of validating that people or processes are who they claim to be. One of the more popular but less secure authentication techniques is single factor authentication. With single factor authentication, we have a method of authenticating that in most cases only requires a password to verify identity. Quite frankly, it's shocking that some organizations still have this method implemented. A more secure way would be to include two-factor or multi-factor authentication, which both requires multiple levels of authentication. Also, two-factor or multi-factor authentication may be used to include an extra security layer as a step up and flexible authentication. Some examples of single factor authentication would be, as previously stated, simply a password. But if we want a more advanced method, we would include something you know, we would associate a PIN number, or something you are, for example, biometrics. So we're still talking about access management, which brings us to authorization. So what is authorization? Authorization is the simple process of verifying what people or processes have access to after authenticating. Here in the United Kingdom, we have some common authorization approaches that we like to use to include the token-based approach, role-based access control approach, as well as ACLs, right? So with the token-based approach, this simply works by ensuring that each request sent to a server is accompanied by a signed token, which the server verifies for authenticity and only then uses that response for the request. The role-based approach works by involving setting permissions and privileges that enables access to authorized users. So within our organizations, we use role-based access control to provide our employees with varying levels of access control based on their roles as well as their responsibilities. So what this does, it protects us. It protects our sensitive data and ensures that employees can only access information and perform actions that they need to do their jobs. With the access control list, we use that approach as a measure to regulate who can view or access organizational resources within our environment. This approach often relies on authentication as well as authorization. We've discussed authentication, we've discussed authorization, but also essential to the United Kingdom is access control. So let's briefly delve into access control types. We'll start with MAC, or mandatory access control. Typically, we associate this form of access control within military environments and how data is classified or labeled. For example, unclassified, confidential, secret, top secret, etc. Role-based access control, we won't get too far into the weeds with that. It was already previously discussed, but the primary takeaway is it focuses on roles associated with the data's access or restrictions. Discretionary access control is what it says. It's the resource owner designating who has access to a certain resource. Lastly, rule-based access control. These are rules or parameters that allow access only from, for example, certain IPs, or denying access from certain IPs, or something more specific that we can assign via group policy or other ways of control. Threats and vulnerabilities. Threats and vulnerabilities. We normally hear these terms used interchangeably. However, there are differences. It's important that everyone here in attendance understands the distinctions. A threat is what the United Kingdom and every allied nation here in attendance is trying to defend against. Vulnerabilities, on the other hand, are gaps or weaknesses that undermine an organization or homeland security posture, typically found within people, technology, or processes. When there's a threat and when there's a vulnerability, it creates a risk. And when there's a risk, we need to assess and analyze that risk to understand its impact on cybersecurity posture. It's also important to note that people, processes, and technology serve as the primary pillars that promote organization and homeland resiliency, meaning the mentioned pillars are essential and should be used as foundations to implement cybersecurity strategy. Here in the UK, these are some of the common threats and vulnerabilities we aim to safeguard. I would assume that our allied partners face some of the same cybersecurity hurdles as well, hence making it ever essential to collaborate and share mitigation strategies. In many cases, people often remain the most significant threat to an organization. A gap in skills or social engineering often attribute to a risk of an insider. Whether intentional or unintentional, the insider threat is real. We often implement policies or procedures that are outdated, ambiguous. A lot of times, these policies that we implement do more harm than good if not properly managed and maintained. With technological solutions, we must make sure that the implemented solutions are continuously managed, fine tuned, and tested. Technology is certainly a gateway for organizational exploitation. As promised, our United Kingdom vulnerability matrix. We previously outlined the importance of the vulnerability assessment, and as you can see here, we have vulnerabilities and threats that have high impact on our cybersecurity posture, as well as a myriad of associated attack vectors. I'm almost certain that everyone in this room shares the same concerns and have similar results. In a moment, we'll cover mitigation strategies as well as recommendations. After determining the specific attack vectors, it was essential to identify the root cause or attribution associated with adverse network traffic. Identifying attribution in many cases is extremely difficult because attackers often rely on deception and advanced obfuscation techniques that hide their identity. Luckily, with John, Robert, Matt, Eric, and myself, we were able to conduct an extensive forensic investigation to determine attribution, as the United Kingdom has some of the best cybersecurity professionals in the world. Listed are known actors and their primary motivators. When it comes to risk tolerance, risk response strategies will vary depending on an already established level of acceptance. So here in the United Kingdom, we do a periodic risk assessment to determine what particular risks we want to avoid, mitigate, transfer, or accept. Of course, depending on criticality, we may choose to accept, mitigate, prevent, or transfer certain risks. In any event, it's essential to understand the scope of the risk and how it aligns with critical organizational functionality. These five aspects are part and parcel of a comprehensive risk assessment and analysis that we highly recommend here in the United Kingdom. As we know, there isn't a particular way to completely eliminate risk. However, there are a number of ways to manage and mitigate risk to acceptable levels. A recommended approach would be to implement periodic awareness training. This would ultimately help transform end users from being just risks to being extensions of the security team and security strategy. Also, it's important to implement authentication, authorization, access control, things of that nature. Also, we must implement proper change, configuration, and patch management. We can't forget about proper trust relationships, whether it be equipment or proper trust relationships within our allied nations. Disaster recovery and continuity plans are extremely important as well. And we definitely can't forget about periodic and thorough risk assessments. This concludes Team United Kingdom Cybersecurity Risk Assessment, and thank you so much for attending. If there are any questions or concerns, please contact Team United Kingdom. Thank you.